Dust floated in the air like dirty snow, catching in the dying light of late afternoon until the whole street looked dipped in ash. The town Jack had known his whole life was gone, swallowed by ruin. What had been a neat row of brick shops and corner cafes was now a broken spine of concrete and steel, beams jutting like bones through a body that no longer breathed. The smell was a punch in the gut. Wet plaster, scorched insulation, and something metallic that coated his tongue like blood. His boots crunched over shards of glass that glittered like frost, though the heat that rolled off the rubble told another story. Everything felt wrong. The sky bruised yellow, the air so thick with grit it scraped his throat raw. He had seen storms, hurricanes, even fires, but nothing like this. This wasn't weather. This was the earth turning against itself. Jack stood at the edge of what used to be Main Street. His shoulders hunched under the weight of silence. Not real silence, there were still sounds if you listened hard enough. The hiss of settling dust, the occasional ping of twisted metal contracting in the heat. But no voices. No laughter from the diner that had stood for 40 years. No chatter from kids pedaling home from school. Just absence, heavy and crushing, pressing on his chest until he wanted to scream just to break it. His hand dipped into his pocket, fingers brushing the worn edge of a photograph he'd carried like a talisman. A little girl with braids and a grin so wide it seemed to swallow the sun. His daughter Emma, who now swallowed in the same kind of hell that stretched before him. He told himself he'd stop coming here, stop chasing ghosts through piles of concrete. But here he was. And then he heard it. At first, Jack thought it was just the wind, threading through the gutted skeletons of buildings. A thin whistle, sharp enough to cut through the hum of his own thoughts. He stilled, breath caught in his chest, eyes scanning the rubble like it might sprout teeth. Then it came again. Higher this time, trembling, a sound with edges alive in its desperation. His heart punched hard against his ribs. He knew the sound of pipes groaning, of beams shifting under strain. This wasn't that. This was softer, fragile, a cry. Not human, though. He could tell now. Too small, too jagged, like it was being ripped from a throat running out of strength. He moved without thinking, boots scraping over rock as he crossed the first heap of debris. The metal edge of a beam bit into his palm when he used it for leverage, slicing a line of fire across his skin. He hissed, but didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The closer he got, the worse it smelled. Damp concrete, mixed with insulation fibers that stung his nostrils, a chemical tang that burned the back of his throat. Dust turned the world to fog, swirling in gritty clouds that stuck to his sweat and crawled into his lungs. Jack yanked his shirt collar over his nose and pushed on, clambering over slabs of cement, his muscles screaming from the strain. His knees slipped on a slick patch of pulverized stone, sending him crashing to his hands. Pain lanced through his wrists, and when he pulled them back, blood striped his knuckles. It didn't matter, because there was again that sound. Closer now, weaving through the crackle of settling debris. Jack dropped to his knees and pressed an ear to the rubble. The dust was so thick here he could feel it clinging to his lashes, turning his vision into a grainy blur. He held his breath and listened. For a moment, there was only the pounding of his own pulse. Then faint, fragile, frayed at the edges, a mule. Jesus, he whispered, voice cracking in the dead air. A cat, had to be. Somehow impossibly alive down there. Jack's stomach knotted as his gaze swept the mound. A tangle of broken stone and splintered beams, stacked like a cruel puzzle. He dug in with his bare hands, nails scraping against concrete until they tore. The top slab didn't move, not even a shiver. He braced his boots and pulled harder, muscles bunching, pain tearing through his shoulders like old rope snapping. But the rock just sat there, mocking him. A grunt ripped from his throat, raw and animal, as he shoved harder, teeth clenched so tight his jaw screamed. Finally, the slab shifted an inch, coughing up a plume of dust that burned his lungs like fire. Jack heaved it aside and went for the next, his breath coming in ragged bursts, sweat streaking black through the ash on his skin. Each piece he moved sent a shiver through the pile, pebbles skittering down like warning shots. This whole thing was balanced on hope and gravity, and every second he touched it felt like tempting fate with both hands. Somewhere behind him, voices called out muffled through the haze, maybe rescue workers or neighbors combing for life. Jack wanted to shout, to tell them where he was, but the cry came again and erased everything else. It was thinner now, weaker, like a thread fraying under too much weight. His gut twisted hard. He yanked another chunk of plaster free, the skin across his palms peeling in strips, blood slicking the grit until it turned to mud under his fingers. His vision blurred, not just from the smoke but from something hot behind his eyes. Emma's face flickered there, unbidden, smiling the way she used to when she'd sneak stray kittens into the house. Her whisper like a secret charm. "You can't leave them, Daddy, you can't." Jack choked down the lump in his throat and kept digging, pulling until the tendons in his arms felt like they'd snap. And then through the jagged ribs of stone and wood he saw it. Just a sliver at first. A gleam of green catching the last spit of sunlight filtering through the ruin. An eye, wide, blazing, terrified. For one breathless second, the world shrank to that single spark of life staring back at him. He reached in, fingers stretching toward matted fur, when the ground beneath his knees trembled. The rubble let out a low groan, deep as a wounded animal, and a crack raced across the beam above his head. Jack froze, dust streaming in lazy ribbons as the structure shifted with a sinister grace. He had just enough time to throw his arms over his head before the beam split with a sound like a gunshot, and the shadow fell. The sound of splitting timber ripped through the air, followed by a boom that shook the ground like a war drum. Jack didn't think, he just moved, rolling onto his side as the beam came down in an explosion of dust and sparks. The shockwave slammed into his ribs, knocking the breath clean out of him. For a few seconds there was nothing but black, his ears ringing so loud it drowned the world. He coughed hard, hacking grit from his lungs, until shapes began to claw their way back into focus. Jagged silhouettes, broken light filtering through cracks above. He tried to push himself up and froze, his legs wouldn't move. A slab of concrete, big as a coffin lid, pinned him from the waist down. Panic punched him square in the gut, stealing the last of his air. He gripped the slab's edge, muscles screaming as he heaved, but it barely shivered. "No." The words shredded his throat, swallowed by the groan of the ruins shifting overhead. Pebbles pattered down like rain. Somewhere behind him, something heavy toppled, crashing into the debris with a sound that made his blood run cold. The whole mound was alive now, breathing, flexing its weight like it wanted to finish what it started. Jack's pulse thundered as he braced and shoved harder, every tendon in his arms stretched to the point of tearing. The rock didn't care. It sat there, solid as death, while sweat streaked black across his face and blood dripped from his split knuckles. Then, through the rasp of his breath and the pounding in his skull, came that sound again. A mule, thin as thread, curling through the dust like a ghost. Jack twisted his head, blinking through the grit stinging his eyes. There, just beyond arm's reach, through a lattice of splintered boards and pulverized stone, gleamed that same green spark. An eye, wide and wild, catching what little light bled through the cracks. "Hang on," he rasped, voice breaking around the words. His fingers clawed at the rubble, dragging himself forward inch by inch despite the weight crushing his hips. Every movement tore fire through his legs, every breath a knife sawing through his chest, but he didn't stop. Couldn't, because that eye didn't blink, didn't look away. It burned at him, pulling him through the dark like a beacon in a sea of ash. He reached the gap and shoved his arm through, skin ripping where jagged edges bit deep. His fingertips brushed something soft fur, wet and matted, trembling against his touch. The cat flinched, a shudder so violent it rattled through his bones. "Easy," Jack whispered, though the words sounded alien in the roar of his heartbeat. "I got you." He curled his fingers around the rope cinched tight around its tiny body. His stomach lurched, tied. The damn thing was tied to a splintered chair leg buried in the heap. He yanked at the knot, but it was slick with soot and twisted so tight it felt carved from stone. A raw snarl ripped from his throat as he dug his nails in, ripping skin, warm blood slicking his grip. The rope didn't budge. Above him, the ruins groaned again, the sound deep and hungry, and a plume of dust cascaded over his head in a choking wave. Jack coughed until stars burst behind his eyes, his lungs clawing for air that wasn't there. He thought of Emma, then not the smiling photo, but the last call before the world cracked open. Her voice trembling like this cat's breath. "Daddy, you'll come, right? You'll find me?" The memory was a blade twisting in his gut. He wrenched at the knot like a man possessed, pain detonating through his arms, until at last finally it gave the smallest twitch. Hope flared, wild and bright, and he pulled harder, teeth bared, grunting like an animal in the dark. The fibers began to fray under his blood-slicked fingers. One more pull. Just one, the ground moved. Not a shiver this time, a lurch. violent and sudden, that rolled through the heap like a living thing. Jack slammed a hand down to brace as the debris roared, a thunderous, grinding bellow that swallowed the cat's scream and his own. Cracks spidered across the ceiling above, raining shards of glass and stone, and the slab pinning his hips shifted not off him, but deeper, crushing harder until white fire shot up his spine and his vision went white. Somewhere beyond the haze of agony, he felt the rope tear loose under his fingers, but he didn't feel victory, only terror. Because with a sound like the world snapping in half, the entire wall above them tilted and began to fall. The sound was a roar, deafening and deep, like the earth splitting its own bones. Jack didn't think, he couldn't think. The wall above him tipped, a shadow swallowing what little gray light still filtered through the gaps. And for one fractured heartbeat, he was certain this was the end. He curled over the cat, clutching its wiry frame to his chest as the world collapsed in a rain of stone and splintered wood. The impact shook through him like a car crash, driving the air from his lungs in a single, brutal punch. Dust blasted into his mouth, choking him, turning every breath into a fight that scraped like knives. Then silence. Not real silence. The kind that hums in your bones after an explosion, where your heartbeat feels louder than the world. Jack coughed until stars tore through the black behind his eyes. His throat burned raw, and every gasp was a gulp of poison, thick with grit. He shifted, wincing as agony clawed up his spine. The slab on his legs was gone, but in its place lay a lattice of debris, pinning him at the knees like shackles forged from ruin. Above, the crack of settling rubble split the air, a warning as sharp as a blade. The rest was coming down. The cat writhed in his arms, a frantic bundle of fur and fear, its claws slicing through his shirt into his skin. "Easy," he rasped, his voice shredded to nothing. He tried to push to his elbows, but his right arm trembled like a snapped wire, blood dripping from his torn palm. He had minutes, maybe less. He twisted, eyes scouring the shadows for any way out. There barely a breath of space between two broken beams, a pocket of gray where daylight kissed the dust, a way out. Or at least a promise of one. Jack shoved at the wreckage trapping him, every movement setting fire to his muscles. His ribs screamed. His back howled. Sweat stung his eyes as he levered one chunk free, sending it tumbling into the darkness with a crash that echoed like gunfire. The gap widened by inches, not enough. He reached again, gripping splintered wood so hard it sliced through his palm until blood slicked the grain like paint. The cat's tiny heart slammed against his chest, wild and fast. A drumbeat of life that pulled him forward when his own pulse faltered. The dust thickened, boiling in the stale air until it turned the space into a blind, suffocating hell. Jack tore a strip from his shirt and tied it over the cat's face instinct. Memory, a trick from some long-ago survival manual before pressing his own mouth to his sleeve. It didn't help much. Every breath still burned, scouring his throat raw. He clawed another beam loose, his hands little more than torn meat now, nails ripped to the quick, skin hanging in flaps. Somewhere deep in the rubble, something groaned, a long guttural moan that rolled through the ground and up his bones. The structure wasn't done falling. Jack froze, heart jack-hammering, as a pebble danced across the floor in front of him. Then another. A hiss of grit poured down like rain, stinging his face, and the sound came a sound he'd never forget. The kind that doesn't just fill the air but empties it. The slow, grinding scream of weight shifting overhead. Jack grabbed the cat and shoved it toward the gap, his voice a rasping command through shredded lungs. "Go!" But the cat didn't move. It clung to him, claws hooking deep, green eyes blazing with terror. "Damn it, move!" He tried again, but before his hands could force it through, the ceiling above fractured in a spiderweb of cracks, and light speared down in sudden, searing shafts. The world tilted. A beam dropped like a guillotine, smashing into the floor so close it clipped his shoulder, ripping a scream from his throat. Pain detonated down his arm like an electric shock, leaving its dead weight hanging from his body. Jack clutched the cat to his chest with his left hand, every nerve howling as he shoved forward into the shrinking pocket of gray. Behind him, the ruin roared, a sound of hunger and hate, and he knew that if he didn't make it out now, the earth would close its jaws for good. He rammed his shoulder into the gap, glass teeth biting into his flesh. Fire shooting through torn muscles as he forced his body through space meant for air, not men. The cat vanished ahead of him in a flash of black, a streak of life swallowed by light, and then something gave way behind him, with a crack that split the world. Jack twisted his head, choking on dust, and saw it. The last wall, the one holding the mountain of ruin at bay, splitting clean down the middle. It swayed once, slow and almost graceful, before starting its deadly fall. Toward him, toward everything. The wall fell like a mountain tearing loose, the sound a jagged scream that ripped through the dark. Jack didn't think there was no time to think. He shoved his body forward with everything left in him. His left arm cradling the cat tight against his chest, his shoulder slamming into the splintered frame. Pain detonated through him, white-hot, stealing the air from his lungs, but he couldn't stop. Behind him, the ruin came down in a roar, a tidal wave of stone and steel crashing into the space where he'd been seconds before. The force punched through his legs, snapping something sharp inside his hip, but he dragged himself on, clawing at the jagged ground until his hands were nothing but torn flesh and grit. Daylight stabbed through the gap ahead, blinding and holy against the black. Jack lunged for it, ribs screaming with each breath, vision flickering as the edges of the world turned gray. The cat wriggled, its tiny claws hooking into his shredded shirt, its heart a wild drum against his chest. "Hold on," he begged silently, his lips too dry, too raw to shape the words. "Hold on for me." He shoved his arm through the gap, felt cool air kiss his fingers, a whisper of freedom before fire lashed across his back as the collapsing wall spat sparks and heat. Jack roared, a sound torn from somewhere deep and primal, and drove his shoulder into the breach. Wood splintered. Glass shrieked. Flesh tore. He didn't care. One more push. Just one, and then he was through. He spilled into the open with all the grace of a broken thing, tumbling across dirt that burned his torn palms like ice. For a moment, the shock of cool air was worse than fire. A blast that made his lungs seize before they dragged in a ragged, glorious gulp of life. Jack collapsed, the world tilting in dizzy spirals as voices rose like ghosts from the haze. Hands grabbed him, tugging, dragging, strong voices barking words he couldn't string together. All he saw was the caddis streak of black trembling in the dust, its sides heaving, eyes still blazing green against the ruin. It staggered, then crawled, and in the space between heartbeats, it pressed its soot-streaked face into the crook of his arm. Jack felt the weight of it, a whisper, a spark, and something inside him cracked wide open. He didn't cry when the paramedics swarmed him, didn't flinch when they pried his shredded hands open or cinched a mask over his face. But when the cat let out a broken purr, thin and warbling against his ribs, a sound so stubborn and alive it felt like defiance itself, Jack's eyes flooded. Hot, unspilled tears burned tracks down his dirt-caked cheeks, mixing with blood and ash. "You made it," he thought, his fingers curling weakly against the creature's fragile spine. "You damn miracle, you made it." And for the first time since Emma's voice faded into silence, Jack felt something other than emptiness yawning inside him. He felt tethered, pulled back from the edge by a heartbeat no bigger than his hand. Hours later, the sky bled to indigo over the smoking skeleton of the block. Jack sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, a blanket draped over his shoulders, his ribs bound tight. The cat lay curled against his chest inside the folds, its fur still streaked with soot, but its eyes fierce as coals in the fading light. Round them, the ruins whispered under the wind, a dirge of settling stone and dreams turned to dust. Jack stared into the smoke-stained horizon where the first star dared to pierce the dark, and let the weight of the day settle in his bones. He had come here empty, chasing echoes of what he'd lost. He was leaving with something else entirely, not a replacement, not a cure, but a reason. A spark. He pressed his lips to the top of the cat's head, feeling the tremor of its breath against his mouth, and whispered into the cold, "You're safe now. And so am I." The cat purred again, faint but steady, like the first note of a song clawing its way back from silence. And for the first time in forever, Jack believed in tomorrow.